Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Russian Revolution area of Study 1. For this topic, which is World War I and the February Revolution, there are actually going to be 3 videos. So this one is topic 4.1, which is World War I. Now, I'm going to start with a brief quote from Friedrich Engels, who worked with Karl Marx to produce the Communist Manifesto. Engels said, "War is the midwife of every old society, pregnant with a new one." So what he seems to be saying here is that all old civilizations and old ways of life, so big change, such as revolution, is born from war. War is the midwife of every old society, pregnant with a new one. Interesting quote to keep in mind as we move forward. So first of all, we're going to talk about causes of Russia's involvement in World War I. So on the 28th of June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by a member of a Serbian terrorist group, the Black Hand. This was the triggering event for World War I. Now, the fact that the assassin was of Serbian descent is quite significant for Russia, because while the Austrian government sought German support for a declaration of war on Serbia, Serbia was an ally of Russia, and so they appealed to Russia for support. On the 17th of July, so a few weeks after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Tsar Nicholas ordered the full mobilization of his troops against Austria. Now, the day before that, he ordered a partial mobilization, similar, I suppose, to what we're seeing currently between Russia and Ukraine, with Russia partially mobilizing troops against Ukraine. But then one day later, he ordered a full mobilization. Now, this put enormous pressure on Germany, and 2 days later, Germany declared war on the Russian Empire. 3 days after that, the Great War had begun because Austria had mobilized, Germany had declared war on France and invaded Belgium, and Britain had declared war on Germany. Now we are into the Great War. So in Russia, I mean, if you think back to the Russo-Japanese War, you might have some understanding of what the initial response was to war. Not the fact that they lost the war, because that was a whole 9 years prior, so that was almost forgotten at this point. But the fact that when one goes to war, there is a huge boost of patriotism. So the declaration of war, as I said, led to an immediate rise in Russian nationalism and patriotism. This led to the government changing the name of St. Petersburg to Petrograd. So that's quite significant, because the reason for that is that St. Petersburg sounds quite German, whereas Petrograd is far more Russian. So from now on, from the beginning of World War I, St. Petersburg will now be referred to as Petrograd. The Duma dissolved itself until the end of the war so that they would not interfere in the war effort. And strikes and protests dramatically declined around the country, and revolutionaries who questioned the war, such as Lenin, were seen as traitors. So immediately, the response to the war was one of patriotism and pride in Russia. In terms of Russia's readiness for war, Russia mobilized 6.5 million men, but they only had 4.6 million rifles available. So that's a whole nearly 2 million soldiers that did not even have guns. So they weren't all that ready in that respect. The soldiers without a gun were told to pick one up from the wounded or dead. So they were literally sent into battle with it without weapons. Canvas boots were acceptable for a summer campaign, but not suitable for winter conditions or trench warfare. So they didn't have the right clothing for trench warfare or winter battles. Russian generals were generally appointed based on loyalty to the Tsar rather than competence, and therefore they were ignorant of modern military tactics and lacked tactical initiative. So Russia wasn't all that prepared industrially in terms of having enough weapons to maintain a war. And they also didn't have strong leadership. They weren't ready in terms of their generals and their leadership. Having a look at the military campaigns, there were 4 significant military campaigns for Russia. The first one, Battle of Lemberg, which took place between the 5th to the 21st of August 1914, that was a win for Russia. Russia defeated Austrian forces and captured the Galician capital of Lemberg. They actually basically crushed the Austrians and wiped out, I think it was a third of the Austrian army. So Battle of Lemberg, great start for Russia. At the same time, however, over 4 days, there was the Battle of Tannenberg. So while Russia defeated the Austrian forces, Germany was a whole other beast. And so it was a poorly planned offensive by a Russian army that outnumbered the Germans. They had more feet on the ground. Russia was known at this time as the Russian steamroller. They had such a huge army that it was like a steamroller going through battle. However, even though they outnumbered the Germans, the Germans were far better prepared and far better led. Therefore, 70,000 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded and 100,000 were captured. That goes against Germany's 15,000 killed or wounded. And so the Battle of Tannenberg was a huge loss for Russia. The Battle of Masurian Lakes was another loss for Russia. All of these first 3 battles have taken place in the first year of the war. Russia lost 60,000 men against the German offensive and were forced to retreat from German territory. They were kicked out of German territory from these 2 battles that took place over the course of 3 weeks. In the Battle of Masurian Lakes, the German soldiers from the Battle of Tannenberg were supported through really good train networks from Germany by more soldiers. And so they were far more prepared for another offensive, while Russia didn't have the infrastructure to get reinforcements to the front line. And the 4th major military campaign was known as the Brusilov Offensive. This was the 22nd of May to the 31st of July, 1916. So this is 2 years later. Now, this started as a win for Russia. General Alexei Brusilov, who was one of the few genuinely talented Russian military commanders, led a campaign in 1916 that caused the collapse of the Austrian-Hungarian front. They basically wiped out the Austrian-Hungarian army. However, 550,000 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded, and reinforcements were slow to arrive, which brought the Russian advance to a halt. So they made this great start with the Brusilov offensive, and then because of poor leadership from the high command, the Russians, this attack didn't go anywhere, and they couldn't do much against Germany. So they're the 4 major military campaigns. 2 major defeats are the Battle of Tannenberg and the Battle of Masurian Lakes. 1 major victory with the Battle of Lemberg, and 1 that started as a victory but turned into a pretty disappointing offensive with the Brusilov offensive. Now, the effects of the war. There are multiple effects of the war, and we can sort of split them up into the human cost of the war, the economic effects, and all things that fall under economic impacts. So Russia lost more soldiers in World War I than any other country. In terms of just lives lost, Russia lost the most. A quarter of Russian soldiers were sent to the front unarmed, as we mentioned before, and Russia lost so much territory that 23 million Russians lived under German occupation. So they lost soldiers and territory. That's not very good for a population that started out really patriotic and expecting Russia to steamroll over the opposing armies. The economic impact was great as well, with Russian industry solely focused on production for the war effort at the expense of Russia's civilian population. So all of this industrial work was happening to support the war effort, producing weapons and things like that, which meant that Russia's civilian population were abandoned during the war in a way. Russia's poor railway infrastructure was unable to cope. So at this point, the Trans-Siberian Railway had not been yet completed. And so weren't very good supply lines between the front of between the armies, and also to get the resources from the east of Russia to European Russia. Inflation increased exponentially. This had the greatest impact on Russia's working classes. So inflation is when the value of the currency, so the currency becomes far more valuable. So for instance, $100, if inflation increased, that would jump up to $200, $300, $400. So something that you would be able to buy for $100 would now be worth much more. So this had the greatest impact on Russia's working classes, obviously, because they didn't have much money. And so inflation was really damaging to them. The demand for peasants to serve in the army reduced the agricultural output. So there wasn't just it wasn't just Russian industry that was struggling to support the civilian population, but also Russian agriculture. So there wasn't enough food, and that played a huge role in the outbreak of the February Revolution. By 1916, the calorie intake of workers had fallen by a quarter, so they were starving, and infant mortality had doubled, so their children would die. Meanwhile, Russia's business elites were able to vastly increase their wealth. At times of war, it's often the super wealthy, the bourgeoisie, that can increase their wealth while everyone else suffers. War and politics. So we're going to have a look at Tsar Nicholas, as well as the role of the Duma. Tsar Nicholas refused to cooperate with non-governmental organizations such as the Union of Zemstvos and the Union of Towns, which sought to assist with the war effort. Similarly, support from the War Industries Committee, an organization of patriotic businessmen who tried to assist with the war effort, was rejected by the Tsar and his ministers. So all of these non-governmental organizations were offering to help. They wanted to help with the war effort, to help Russia in the war. But the Tsar and his government ministers didn't accept their help. The Tsar recalled the Duma on 19th of July 1915, after the Duma had dissolved itself the previous year. But the war led many Duma deputies to become increasingly critical of the government. By August 1915, a number of cadet and Octoberist deputies formed a political alliance called the Progressive Bloc. Now, remember that cadets both of these groups were constitutional monarchists. They both believed in the monarchy, but they believed in a constitutional monarchy. The cadets wanted more reforms, while the Octoberists were, at the end of 1905, they were quite pleased with the Tsar. So the fact that cadets and Octoberists formed the Progressive Bloc was quite significant. And the Progressive Bloc's intention was to avert revolution through further reforms. Nicholas rejected these proposals and sacked any ministers who supported the reformers. So they wanted further reforms to try and stop the upswing of revolutionary action. But Nicholas did not accept these reforms. On the 3rd of September 1915, the Duma was dissolved yet again, this time by Nicholas. And Pavel Milyakov, who, if you remember from when we were learning about the different political parties, he was a leader of the cadets and a prominent member of the Progressive Bloc. He said the following quote: "They brushed aside the hand that was offered them." So what we can see here through all of these examples is that there were all these groups, non-governmental organizations or sections of the Duma that wanted to support the government and help them, and the government did not accept their help. Continuing on with war and politics, Pavel Milyakov, on the 14th of November 1916, so this is 3 months before the February Revolution, he delivered the following damning speech to the Duma. "When the Duma keeps everlastingly insisting that the rear must be organized for a successful struggle, the government persists in claiming that organizing the country means organizing a revolution, and deliberately prefers chaos and disorganization. What is it? Stupidity or treason?" This is a shocking and damning accusation of the Tsar. Basically, he's saying that the Tsar and his government, his ministers and things like that, are being treasonous. They're either being stupid or they are committing treason against Russia. So this was a really powerful speech and it was banned nationwide. However, it was circulated among, it came onto the black market and was circulated throughout Russia. And it articulated the political crisis that was unfolding in Russia to the point that even conservative supporters of the monarchy agreed with the sentiment. Basically, the Tsar had done a terrible job with the war, and it was being noticed by even the most conservative. Now, this is the last slide, and it's about Tsar Nicholas and one of his most fatal flaws during the war. On 22nd of August 1915, so a year into the war, Tsar Nicholas dismissed Grand Duke Nikolai and appointed himself commander-in-chief of Russia's army forces. All of the Tsar's advisors urged him not to go to the front. The only one that told him that he should go to the front to show his strong leadership was his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, who we mentioned in a separate Topic 4 video. The Tsar had no experience in military command, so all major battlefield decisions were made by the Chief of Staff, General Alexiev. But because he has pronounced himself commander-in-chief, any military failures were attributed directly to Tsar Nicholas. As such, President of the Duma, Mikhail Rodzianko, wrote to the Tsar in August 1915. This is a fantastic quote to keep in mind, or take sections of this quote to talk about how much of a disaster it was for Nicholas to assume the role of commander-in-chief. So Rodzianko, president of the Duma, wrote the following to the Tsar. The situation will be even worse if the army loses courage. In this event, defeat is inevitable, and within the country, revolution and anarchy will then inevitably break out. Your Majesty, before it is too late, revoke your decision to become commander-in-chief, no matter how hard it may be for you. So this is 2 years before the revolution, and Rodzianko, the president of the Duma, is begging the Tsar not to appoint himself commander-in-chief, because Rodzianko can see that if he does that and the army continues to lose battles and lose courage, then revolution is inevitable. So that is the end of this video on World War I. There is far more information that you could find out about World War I by looking at your textbook. The next video will focus on the February Revolution. Thanks.